just loved Dale's read, so I'm just doing the offering message, and I want you to keep up in your spirit. Like Dale's read to me was about God looks at us, He wants that rose-tinted relationship between both of us, the back and the forth, the giving and the receiving, and I just love that because it created flow. So just stay in the spirit because I'm excited. So this morning, in relation to a tithe, what I want to look at is the idea that if we give what we have in our hands now, if we acknowledge God in any situation, we receive the promise of that thing that we don't yet have. So let me say that another way. If you sow what's in your hands now, acknowledge God in any circumstance, then you receive that promise of things yet to come. This giving and receiving is not only a part of the tithe process, but God's desired flow for us. So to explore this giving and receiving flow, we'll look at the first time the tithe was given in the Bible. So we'll go to Genesis chapter 14, and it goes right through to Genesis 15. So for the sake of time, I'll just tell you the story of how the first tithe came about. The passage of this first mention of a tithe has a classic beginning, middle, and an end. And we see in the beginning part that it's talking about Abram, and he's in a real pickle. His nephew Lot has been taken captive when there was a war. There was 5 kings on one side and 4 kings on another. And the 4 kings came in a raid and took Lot away. So Abram's response when he heard this was to take the 318 men he had and to go and try and get Lot back. Now you may well be thinking like me that 318 men against 4 kings is not looking too flash. But Abram gave what he had in his hands now, and he created flow. It says in verse 16 that Abram recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with all the women and all the other people. By Abram giving what he had in his hand, it allowed for God to supernaturally add to the flow. So after rescuing Lot back from the kings, a priest, Melchizedek, he comes out to Abram and he blesses him. He's saying, "Blessed are you, Abraham, by God Most High, the Creator of heaven and earth. Blessed be God Most High, who's delivered your enemies into your hand." So, by having what he had in his hand, his faith in God, his 318 men, he received those things that he did not yet have: his nephew, his possessions, and his enemies delivered into his hand. So it was at this time that Abram gave the priest a tenth of everything he had, the first tithe. So then we get to the middle part of the story, because in verse 21 it shows us that straight after Abram had given his tithe, his enemy, the king of Sodom, came to Abraham and he said, "Give me back the people and you can keep all the goods for yourself." So Abram responded to this choice by the enemy, saying, "I've raised my hand to God Most High and I will accept nothing from the king of Sodom." So Abraham raised his hand and stayed in the flow. So this temptation came in the midst of a need for Abram's own personal breakthrough. And here we get to the end part of the tithe passage. Because we see as the scriptures carry on into Genesis that this is when God speaks to Abram about a struggle that he had himself. He had no son and no heir. So Abram and Sarah were childless, and during their own personal heartache and struggle, Abram was faithful to use what was in his hand now and give it. And while Abram received his nephew, family, possessions, and his enemies back into his hand, Abram was about to experience an even greater truth about our God. While God is the giver of the promises, we have to receive them in faith to create flow. So this is the flow part. Because the interesting thing about receiving a promise is that we have to receive it in faith in our spirit for it to flow in the natural. So God had already told Abraham several chapters earlier that you will be a great nation, you will have a son. But Abraham is struggling to receive. So God tells Abraham in verses 1 to 5 of Genesis that he will indeed have a son. He reminds Abraham again, and he takes him outside and he says, "Look at the stars, count them if you can. This too shall be your offspring." So as Abraham stood under that great expanse, that open heaven, it says in verse 6, he believed the Lord. He received God's promise to him, his inheritance. So I'm not talking about a giving to get mentality. I'm talking about a flow of giving and receiving lifestyle. I'm not talking about trying to control or orchestrate God's responses, but rather to live in this flow. And it speaks to me of having a trust and a faith in God to use whatever I have in my hand as I stand under an open heaven, knowing that my God is my shield, my very great reward. So I think we are able to stand very strong in the idea of this giving and flow, see. And in this, because God demonstrated this principle himself. John 3:16 says, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but will have everlasting life. This verse has a beginning, a middle, and an end, just like Abram's story. The beginning part is God so loved the world, he gave. He gave what he had in hand, which was his Son, Jesus, for us. The middle part is just like Abram, where there is a choice involved, a choice of which king will you raise your hand to. Will you raise your hand to the King of God of heaven and earth, or will you raise your hand to the enemy? There is always a choice, and the end is the receiving of the promise. God promises eternal life for the future and for our inheritance right now. We have to receive that in our spirit and faith for a flow to come out in the natural. And so God himself gives and receives. He gave what he had at hand, which was Jesus, and he did that to get what he didn't yet have, which was the restored relationship with us. Our God is a God who both gives and receives. My question today to us is, do we appreciate the need for the capacity to be both giving and receiving to create this supernatural flow? Because if we do, we know as we bring the tithe into the storehouse, there'll be food in this house to feed the family. And as we receive God's blessing on us, his inheritance, then the peoples and the nations will call us blessed. So finally, as the buckets are passed around, I think we could just think on Jesus' commission to us when he said to us, freely you have received, freely you have received, now freely give. And know that as we give whatever we have in our hand, or as we receive God's inheritance, either way it creates a supernatural flow that blesses other people.